Hello and welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well. This is a video to discuss the idea of kinship within anthropology and why it's so meaningful to us and why it's important. What we're going to explore is just basically how families are made. I'm going to try to keep this one short as well, but how we construct family as human beings. So when we talk about kinship, really, and family and everything, but when we're talking about kinship here and how you acquire kin, we're talking about culturally defined social ties between members of a community. Now, a lot of people say, but what about biology? What about, blood is thicker than water and all of that? Well, the reality is that for many people, including us, in pretty much every culture, kinship isn't a biological claim. It's a culturally appropriate one, right? So, for example, if you get married, then your spouse or your marriage partner now becomes probably the most important member of your family unit, and replace blood family. Another example in our own culture is adopted children. If I adopt a child, the expectation is that I will treat that child equally to the two children that are my birth kids, right? That is considered culturally appropriated. They're considered the same to us, right? So the truth is, biology isn't really that important when it comes to kinship. Other cultures have different kinds of kinship that we are less familiar with, like blood brothers, age mates, things like that. But across cultures, we see this over and over again. Your book does a really good job talking about this, so I don't want to beat it to death. I just want to show you some different things, and talk about it a little bit. To start with some terms, and it talks about this just to make them really clear. Some terms that are very important when it comes to this is consanguinal, affinal, and fictive. And these are just different kinds of kin that we have. Consanguinal kin is kin by blood, and so, for example, genetic kinship, I guess you might call it, right? It is birth relations, people that you share DNA with. Affinal kin is kin by marriage, and fictive kin is kin by ceremony. And so just a second ago, I gave you a couple of examples of this, right? An adopted child would be something like that, or a blood brother or something in that nature. And again, it's important to note how important this is. I mean, we're going to talk about sort of status and role next time with social groups, but married status is universally higher than unmarried status across the globe. So this is something that is very, very important. And as I said, usually, like, for example, in our culture, if you get married, that automatically means that your next of kin is now this kin by marriage or kin by ceremony. In this case, the ceremony is marriage. So these are really, really important relations that we're talking about here. And because marriage is so important, we often talk about it in a couple of different ways here. One is the big kind of division within marriage is monogamy and polygamy, right? Which, again, I know this is a lot of terms being thrown at you and things like that. Your book talks a little bit about love marriage versus arranged marriage, and I don't really go into that so much here, right? But it's an interesting thing about it, and definitely worth reading on. And remember that arranged marriage is not the same thing as forced marriage. They're very, very different. I know lots of people that have arranged marriages. I've known lots of folks, and then they weren't forced into anything, right? So to talk about these kind of broader categories that we often use, monogamy to start with, right? Monogamy is often divided into traditional and serial. We actually practice serial monogamy, not traditional. The idea in traditional monogamy is that you have one partner for life, period. We practice what's called serial monogamy. You have one partner at a time, right? That's very, very different. Most people that are divorced or widowed actually do marry again. Depending on the age, right? So we've always practiced serial monogamy, right? The next one is polygamy. And when people say polygamy, what they really mean is polygyny. Polygyny is when one husband has many wives, right? One of the more common is actually sororal, where you marry sisters. And before you think that this is, again, something really wild and crazy and arcane, read the Bible, read the Quran, read pretty much any religious text, and you'll find that almost all of us share this in our cultural history and our cultural legacy. And so treating this like it's sort of crazy and foreign and all of this sort of stuff, it just doesn't really hold up, you know. So that's polygyny, but there's also polyandry, which is the inverse, where you have one wife and you have many husbands. Now, it is very, very rare. This includes also fraternal, married to brothers. A lot of anthropologists argue that the benefit of this, where you're marrying siblings, is that the individuals that you're marrying, whether they be brothers or whether they be sisters, so in polygyny or polyandry, part of the argument is that they already know each other, they already get along with each other, they already know how to work together. Part of it is this is going to mean that if somebody dies, then that kid is not just your husband's ex-wife. That kid that you might need to help take care of is also your sister's child, you know, just to create a better family bond. It also impacts inheritance, which your book talks about pretty well with Lewis Henry Morgan and his studies among Native American groups, that if I have, you know, 3 daughters and they all marry different people, when I die, then all of that gets divided up. Whereas if they marry one guy, now all of that money and all of that land and all of that cattle get to stay together, and therefore it makes like sort of a stronger economic engine, right? So there's a lot of arguments as to why this might be a really helpful thing. But as I said, polyandry is quite rare. The only place that I know that it might still be around, and I'm not even sure that it is actually like the steppes of Russia, like Mongolia. In Mongolia, they practiced it there, but they learned very quickly that missionaries got real upset when you talked about this wife sharing lots of dudes who were also brothers, and so they just quit talking about it. And they're like, nope, no one does that anymore. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of become the case there. And there is also some really broad types of family that we can talk about here. So, for example, we often divide families up into unilineal and multilineal, which is terms you may have heard when you were taking general anthropology, right? Unilineal is when you are related to only one side of the family, right? So, for example, you would be related only to mom's side or to dad's side, right? This is about 60% of the world, okay? And those are patrilineal and matrilineal, right? Patrilineal, you're related to your father's side. Matrilineal, or you're related to your mom's side. Multilineal or multilateral, sometimes it's called, is where you're related to both sides of your family. Obviously, that's quite common in the world. The US and Europe practice it, right? About 40% of world cultures, right? It can allow for more adaptability because you have greater individuals to call upon for resources, right? But there's a downside to that. If you have more people that you can call on if you need help, there's more people that can call on you if you need help, right? And so those become very, very important, you know. Speaking of these two unilineal kinship types, right, with patrilineal, just to make it clear, this is where descent is traced through the father's line. Of the like 60% of the world cultures that I was talking about, right, breaking those down, 45% of world cultures are patrilineal, about 15% are matrilineal, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're like politically a matriarchal society, understand? A lot of people think that maybe talks about who has power. That doesn't necessarily. What it talks about is how you reckon kinship. Those can be different things, right? But with matrilineal, it does create some interesting relationships. And I bring this up because, again, you hear this talked about a lot. Like with a matrilineal society, what if you have sons? Who's going to teach them how to do the things that they're supposed to do if the dad isn't around? In a patrilineal society, moms will still be around without question because obviously mom's got to breastfeed. And so mom's still going to be a part of the child's life. But in a matrilineal society, dad isn't necessarily going to be a part of this kid's life because he doesn't have to be. And so a lot of times we talk about, well, you know, who's there to raise this guy and teach him what it means to be a man in this culture. Every culture has gender roles, right? That's just the way of things. That's a reality of it. And so every culture's got gender roles. Who's going to teach this young man how to be a full man? And we often talk about the avuncular relationship, and that word probably sounds like uncle, and it's because it has the same root. The avuncular relationship is that mom's brother belonging to the matrilineal line will probably be very much a father figure in this guy's life, right? And so we say mother's brother will come in and take care of it and teach him how to be a man and everything like that, right? Now, people often point out, what if mom doesn't have an uncle, right? Well, this is, again, one of those cases that I always enjoy pointing out to you guys, that culture is not a rule book. Culture is instead an adaptive mechanism that we use to survive in the world as a species, right? If mom doesn't have an uncle, then maybe she has a cousin. Maybe she has, if mom doesn't have a brother, then maybe she's got a cousin. Maybe she's got, something else. The truth is, in some cases I've read about, you'll actually have dad step back into the picture and help him out just because he feels like it. He's not necessarily obliged to. It's not necessarily his responsibility in this culture, but maybe he just wants to. Maybe he's just that kind of guy, right? So you see this kind of thing, right? It's maybe mom's father is going to step in and do something because she just wants to, he just wants to. So that's the reality of it that we see over and over. Kinship is critically important. As you learned when we were watching Napoleon Chagnon's film, A Man Called V, and he said that, sort of pre-industrial society is organized along kinship lines, right? Well, lots of societies are, including our own, right? But kinship affects who you live with, who you talk to, who you marry, who you don't, but it even affects where you live, right? And so with unilineal descent, it's going to affect you're going to be living with the side, obviously, that you're related to, right? With patrilineal descent, we've got patrilocality, matrilocality. Neolocality is probably the most common here in the United States, where you set up a new residence, although after the Great Recession, we certainly saw a difference in that. Given the current situation and the rise in unemployment in literally the last 30 days, I would imagine we'll be seeing something like that again, where you're going to talk about individuals moving home, living home longer, and things of that nature. Now, this is actually a kinship chart here. This is how, when anthropologists are living and working with people, we chart these things out and we draw them. And you can see this key right here. We use a triangle for males and we use a circle for females. This actually really does go back to an old math thing that, like, the triangle is the most stable shape and a circle is a perfect shape. And so it was sort of this poetic philosophical thing back in the day of using a triangle, this stable man, and this circle, this perfect woman, and bringing them together, right? But nonetheless, right, so this is something that you'll see. Males and females are represented that way. The ego is the subject of the chart. Now, we say that because the kinship term that I use for my oldest daughter is daughter, but her sister doesn't call her daughter, right? Her sister calls her sister to us. And my brother doesn't call her daughter. My brother calls her niece, and these kinds of things. So you have to know whose relationship you're talking about. From this person's point of view, who is this person to them, right? And then you have father and mother and aunts and uncles and, grandmother and grandfather. Now, there's two things that I want to point out here. If you follow up on this, and I'm trying to draw, so we're going to go from ego right here, right? This is ego's father. The father's brother, if you trace this over, is also called father, okay? Mother, this is mother right here. If you follow mother over to her sister, she is also called mother. Now, what's going on here? What's going on here is that this is an Iroquois kinship system. It is different than the one that we use. In an Iroquois kinship system, the same gendered sibling of a parent is going to share the same kinship term, right? Now, I had talked about kinship terms a little bit before. Kinship terms are just that. They are the terms that we use to denote our kinship to someone. So, for example, daughter, father, niece, nephew, cousin, sister, aunt, uncle, grandparent, whatever, okay? In our kinship system, right, we would call all of father's brothers uncle. But they don't do that, right? If you look back here again, father also has a sister, and she is married to a guy that you're going to refer to as uncle, okay? But father's brother is going to be father as well. Now, it's important to understand that with a kinship term, the purpose of a kinship term is to denote your relationship, right? For example, if you have 3 sons, you call all of them son. And that's important because you have the same relationship to them. You are expected to pretty much do the same thing for each of those sons that you do for all of the rest. If you said, well, this is my son, and so I'm going to give them $1 million and pay for their college and buy them a car, and the next one is my son, but I just didn't bother with anything, people would be like, man, you're a terrible human being, you know? You are expected to treat those individuals the same. Now, you may, and you'll see that, aunts and uncles, for example. You might have 5 aunts. Now, sure, you may have a favorite, but the expectation of how you speak to an aunt, how you talk to an aunt, what you have to do for your aunt is going to be the same for all 5 of those women. Why? Because they're all aunts. When you have a cousin, again, maybe you got a favorite one because you guys were born around the same time and grew up. But you treat all of your cousins as pretty much the same way. You treat all of your cousins, you sort of owe them the same thing, they owe you the same thing, right? So kinship terms denote our obligation and our responsibility to an individual. This is why in our culture, you have one person named mom, you have one person named dad. And because of that, and again, I know that it's the 21st century, it never exactly works out this way. And as I've always liked to point out, right, culture is a tool for us to adapt to our environment and survive. It's not a rule book, right? But by and large, for most people in our culture, there's one person you call mom, and that's a pretty unique relationship. You don't really have that relationship with anybody else. There's one person that you call dad, and that's a unique relationship. You don't have it with anybody else, right? Again, your exact situation may be a little bit different because of circumstance. Fair enough, right? But it's something that we see over and over again, okay? And so why then is father's brother called father? Well, they share the same kinship term because you share the same responsibility and obligation to that person and that individual as they do to you. Father's brother is a second father to you. So you call him the same thing. Mother's sister is a second mother to you. And so you call her the same thing, right? But again, it's going to be same gendered because father's sister is not mother, right? That'll be an aunt or something like that, right? Mother's brother is not father, right? It's about having the same gender as the parent, okay? All right, so let me try to get rid of some of this so that I can mark it up again and explain one more really important idea, and that is this idea of parallel and cross cousins, okay? So we are looking at ego here, right? And you've got 4 sets of cousins. Now you'll notice that some are called cross cousins, this and this, whereas some are parallel cousins, right? These guys right here. Now, again, this relates to the gender of the parent that you're talking about, okay? And the gender of the sibling of your parent, okay? I'll say this, and it sounds confusing, but if you think through it for just a minute, it'll make sense. Your parallel cousins are the same gender as your parent, or the offspring of the same gender as your parent. Your cross cousins are the offspring of the opposite gender of your parent, right? Sibling, you know, right? So parallel cousin, same gender, the offspring of the same gendered parent sibling, and cross is the opposite, okay? Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit confusing. You'll also notice that in the Iroquois system, that means you're going to call him something else, because again, if you call this person father, his offspring are going to be called brother and sister, right? You can't go around marrying your brother and sister, okay? So whereas the opposite gender, those are just cousins. To tell you the truth, these cross cousins are almost always going to be a preferred marriage partner for you. And again, before you're like, oh my God, that's so weird and creepy. No, it's not. Throughout most of our recorded history, we've been marrying our first cousins, right? And again, go to the Bible, go to the Torah, go to the Quran, go to any number of other religious scriptures and history books and everything like that. It's quite common. Because after all, that's going to keep those resources in the family. That's going to keep people connected to one another. That's going to re-emphasize our relationship with each other, all of that kind of stuff, right? So there's a lot of reasons that individuals do it. This is actually the exact same thing. It's an Iroquois kinship system. This time it's just color coded to try to help you understand what I was talking about, right? That on the bottom here, right? This is let's say this is you in the middle here, our ego, our little square. And so you'll notice circle is female. This is your sister, but this is your sister and this is your sister too, right? So all three of these individuals are your sister, but these people right here and on the other side right here, those are not your sisters. Those are your cousins, right? And you can see on this, they use CU instead of CO. It doesn't really matter. It's fine either way, just as long as you're consistent, right? Likewise, purple triangle up here is father, but this purple triangle is father too. This, is that gray circle is mother, but this gray circle is mother also. Okay, so does that make sense? So these are all different ways of doing it. I'll also just throw in there real quick. So this is a to show you the if you look at father and mother right here with this equal sign, this indicates marriage of some kind. If they were to get divorced, what we would do is actually just draw a slash through it like that, which indicates that the relationship has ended. If someone dies, right, we just put an X over that that thing to indicate that they are dead. And so that's how we record this. So we can record grandparents and parents. These lines coming down, this is called the descent line, right? And you'll notice each generation stays on its own line, nice and organized, things like that. I'll show you a couple more here. This is an Eskimo kinship system. If you're wondering how these got their name, they were named after the first kind of cultural group that we came across that used these particular kinship systems. This one probably looks real familiar to you because the Eskimo used the same kinship system that we do. But again, we named it for the first peoples that we came across. There are, I want to say 7 or 8 different ones. It's not something that we do a ton anymore in cultural anthropology, but it is still a really important skill, and I'll talk about it in just a second. But so this is an Eskimo kinship system. It probably looks, like I said, real familiar. This is ours, cousins and daughter, son, niece, nephew. It's a bilateral kinship system. You're equally related to each side, all of that kind of stuff, right? As I mentioned a second ago too, first cousin marriage is still quite common. 43% of societies are still fine with it. Only about 57% prohibit it to marry your first cousin. And once you move beyond first cousin to like second cousin, nobody cares at all. It's just one of those things. It's been practiced forever. There's a lot of misconception about it. I'm not advocating first cousin marriage. I'm just saying it's much more common than a lot of people think. So let me just make a quick note here. As I was saying a second ago, we don't really do kinship charts like we used to. It used to be something that was really big in anthropology, and we don't do it as much anymore. But it is still a really critical and key idea. And the reason that I'm bringing it up, the reason that I take time to talk about it is because as an anthropologist, it's still important to understand family as a social network. And so marking that family out, charting that family out can be extremely helpful. It's helped me in my research on multiple occasions. And this is a little more difficult since we're not in the classroom together. But for example, during my research in Mexico, drawing a kinship chart, I realized that some of the relationships that I saw between siblings and between the mother and some of the older versus younger siblings and things like that had a huge economic component because some of the siblings were in the United States working. Younger siblings would then stay in Mexico to take care of their kids. This is helping everybody because since the kids are taken care of, there can be more hands up in the United States and the North working and sending money home through Western Union and stuff like that. And so when you have the younger kids, particularly the younger siblings taking care of the kids, You don't want them to start families of their own, because if they do that, then one of the workers up in the US is going to have to come home and start taking care of their kids again, right? And so if I can get one of my younger daughters to just be content not, dating and starting a family of her own, I can have her watch the kids of 2 or 3 or 4 of my other kids, and then they'll give her a little bit of money, but they're all going to live with me, and then I get a little bit of money, and then they're going to save some money, and we all come out ahead, right? And so it wasn't until I mapped some of these things. I know that doesn't make a ton of sense when I'm explaining it and not showing it, but it wasn't until I mapped these things that I really understood some of the power dynamic that I was seeing in this family, right? And so it can still help to mark out these kinship diagrams. It can help to understand how people are related to one another, and it can also be kind of help you clear your mind of certain things, because you might hear different stuff. For example, if your book talks about some of these. So, for example, in China, right, this is a great example of how kinship terms are also wrapped up in this. In China, there isn't a word for brother, right? There's not one catch-all word for brother. There is a word for older brother, and there's a word for younger brother. And the reason that there are two different words is that you have two different relationships. An older brother you have to listen to. A younger brother has to listen to you. There is not one thing of brother, because there is not one relationship of brother. There is a relationship of older brother, there's a relationship to younger brother, right? And mapping that out can help you understand that, right? Likewise, in many parts of the world, for example, India, they still use these kinship terms that I was talking about with cross and parallel cousins. And so it can be kind of confusing if you don't quite understand that, and being able to mark it out and to map it and stuff like that definitely illuminates this quite a bit. So my question to you is, what does your family look like? For your assignment, what I would like you to do is draw your kinship system with proper terms, including 3 generations, cross and parallel cousins, and I want those labeled. You can use this as a guide, right? I would like this neat and organized. So either get out I don't want this just free drawn squiggly line, right? Draw it on the computer, use Adobe, use PowerPoint, use Word, or if you're going to do it by hand, I expect you to get a ruler out and a compass and draw proper circles and those kinds of things, right? And so I would like you to draw out your family unit and then explain anything to me that is going on there. Remember, if people are divorced, you got to cross out that marriage sign. If people are together but maybe not married, you can do the little squiggly equal sign, those kinds of things. So I'd like to see what your families look like. The due dates and everything will be on Canvas, and I look forward to checking them out. If you need to explain anything, feel free to add. Make sure you have a key, and also feel free to add a word description if you feel it is needed. Thanks, guys.